Hello again, and welcome to our next installment of Foundations in Moral Theology, and also welcome to our final module in looking at our textbook on Aquinas' ethics. In this module, we're going to be focusing on that third and final section of the textbook, which is going to be looking at the virtues, at law and grace, and finally the theologically transformed virtues, or really, for purposes of our module here, looking at what kind of a difference it makes in our understanding of Aquinas and in our understanding of natural law to take the more integrated approach that the textbook authors recommend, that is including an understanding of the human person from a theological perspective and also kind of our supernatural end and an account of law and grace. What kind of a difference is that going to make in practical terms for our ethical system? So we're going to conclude with looking at that, much like the textbook does. What I want to do here is just, as we've done in some of the other modules, walk through the section and kind of talk about it, explain some of the big ideas, and then also focus on some of the key ideas that I think are particularly interesting and important, or expand on some of the ideas a little bit more to perhaps offer a little bit of helpful contrast to the material in the textbook. And really for the first page here of our module, to correspond to kind of the first chapter of this section, obviously we can talk about the virtues. I don't feel a need to talk about this in great length or detail because I think the textbook does a nice job of walking you through the virtues. And we've talked about the virtues indirectly already a number of times, I think, leading up to this. Right? There's this basic idea of how natural law works, where if we do acts that are in accord with our nature, that help us advance towards our proper end, that we can develop a habit. We develop a habit of acting in those right ways, and that's essentially what a virtue is. Right? And of course, a vice is the opposite. When we act contrary to our nature or act contrary to our proper end, we form a bad habit, which is a vice. As you've seen in quite a bit of detail at different points in the book, Aquinas will divide all of those different virtues based on how they fit into his account of the different human capacities. And so again, I think the textbook explains that clearly enough. There's no need to really go over that in detail again here. There's also, of course, this important distinction for Christian accounts of natural law between the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues. Right? The four cardinal virtues are those which are kind of the foundation of Aristotle and kind of classical natural law theory: prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, not necessarily in that order. And then you have the theological virtues drawn explicitly from the Christian tradition of faith, hope, and love. And you're probably all familiar with those. And again, I think the textbook explains that clearly enough. There's also the issue of the infused virtues, right? So that in particular, these theological virtues don't get acquired in quite the same way as virtues do traditionally in a natural law system, right? That in the Christian account of things, we get faith, hope, and love by means of God's grace, that God kind of infuses those virtues into the Christian and is therefore able to give that person an ability to act in ways they wouldn't be able to without that extra infusion of grace, that infusion of virtue. So that this opens up new possibilities for people that wouldn't be available from a purely naturally developed virtue. Now, of course, this is one of the important differences between a Christian natural law theory and classical natural law. It's also a place where you could have some controversy and questions. One could ask, do we really see, for example, in Christians, distinctive differences in their behavior that show that they have these infused, these higher virtues that other people lack? And in fact, there are some ethicists, some religion scholars who would kind of reverse this argument to make the argument that Christianity is not, in fact, ultimately true or not exclusively true, because we don't see in Christians a distinctly superior lifestyle that would be evidence of these infused virtues. Now, how do we make that kind of an argument? It's kind of difficult, right? How do you measure faith, hope, and love, in a Christian group versus a control group? I'm not exactly sure how you design that experiment. But I think it is food for thought, and it's certainly something that could be helpful on a personal level in reflecting on our own lives, our own choices, our own moral acts. If a person were to observe us, would they really see evidence of these infused virtues in our lives, or would we be just like any other naturally good person, or even maybe in some ways not as good as those who maybe don't have these infused virtues? And of course, another possible way of coming at this issue or coming at this problem from one perspective would be to say that just as in more recent church teaching, the Catholic Church has come to the idea, developed the idea that God can extend His grace through Christ in the church to those outside of any visible connection with the church. And so perhaps the same thing could happen in regard to this grace of the infused virtues as well, that perhaps God offers faith, hope, and love in some way to those outside of visible communion with the church, if they are people who are honestly seeking the good, which is understood to be a possibility for receiving grace outside the church. In general, maybe this more specific example of grace is also available to those outside the church, and that would explain why we don't necessarily see a huge difference between, say, a particularly loving Christian and a particularly loving non-Christian, whether they're Hindu or Muslim or whatever it might be. But that is, I think, an interesting question, but one that's not necessarily decisively proof against the infusion of virtues or proof of it. But it's certainly something worth considering. I think the main point that I like to focus on when talking about the virtues and explaining natural law to people is that this is, I think, one of the most positive, the most attractive features of a natural law ethical system. There are some ethical systems where the basic idea is that it's going to always be a continual struggle to do the good, right? So if you're utilitarian, you are essentially going to always have to be determining, what's going to maximize pleasure, minimize pain, and it's not necessarily going to get any easier when you find yourself on the wrong end of that equation and need to do something that's going to cause yourself pain for the greater benefit of others. If you take an ethical system like Immanuel Kant's, which we're not getting into here in this class, but for him, an act is really only morally virtuous if it does require kind of a difficult, purposeful decision to act contrary to your natural inclinations. So for him, the only morally virtuous choices are those ones that require kind of an extraordinary amount of effort to do what we know is right. And natural law basically argues the exact opposite, right? And here I should just pause for a moment and point out something that the textbook has talked about. You can really divide natural law and virtue ethics into kind of two distinct ethical systems based on whether or not you think right and wrong is ultimately rooted in kind of the metaphysical nature of human beings and different creatures, or whether it is ultimately rooted in the virtues that you want to develop in moral agents. Now, I think in Aquinas, as the authors explained, you have both of these kind of systems working together, and really the two systems are ultimately, I think, compatible. But I should just point out that sometimes people do talk about virtue ethics versus natural law. But this, we're specifically talking about the virtues, so it would maybe fall under the realm of virtue ethics, but I think, again, natural law can claim this as part of its system as well. As you choose rightly, and at the beginning this might very well be difficult. You're going to have to choose to be just. You're going to have to choose to be temperate, or all these other different kind of moral acts, and it's going to be difficult. But of course, as you do that, you start to develop a habit. You start to develop the different virtues, and as the textbook explains, this is eventually going to become second nature for you, in a very real sense, that this becomes, in fact, your nature as a person to act justly, to act temperately, and all the other virtues as well. And so really, it becomes easier and easier and easier to do what's right, and less attractive to do what is wrong. And in fact, as your nature develops, it not only becomes easier, it becomes pleasurable, it becomes pleasant, because you're doing what you naturally want to do, what your nature would lead you to do. And that is always something that we find pleasant as creatures, as human beings. And so, again, I think the real advantage of thinking about ethics this way is it's not supposed to always be a struggle. It's not always going to be, I have to fight to do this thing. And that's an important thing, I think, to mention, especially as we go into some of the coming weeks where natural law and Catholic ethics is going to ask people to do things that many people in today's world are going to find very difficult. But it's important when you're explaining that to also point out that, yes, this can be difficult at first. But as you make these right choices, you're going to find it becomes easier over time, and that eventually it's going to become kind of second nature to you. And you're going to actually like living in this way, even though it may seem difficult at the beginning. All right, so again, I think apart from maybe emphasizing a couple of those things there, the textbook explanation of the virtues is very good. So if you have any questions on that, of course, we can talk about that. But for now, let's go ahead and move on to the next page. All right, now that we've talked about the virtues, it's time to turn now to another topic where the textbook is going to highlight some of the distinctive features of Aquinas' ethical system as a Christian natural law system that differentiate it from classical or Aristotelian natural law. And that's the case here with both law and grace. Right? And of course, as the chapter explains, these two topics, these two aspects of natural law, are also connected by the fact that these are external forces that contribute to living a moral life in Aquinas' ethical system. Right? The virtues are internal. It's part of our nature that develops and then guides our conduct. And law and grace are forces from without the person that help guide and shape our moral action in Aquinas' account. And both law and grace are distinctively Christian aspects of natural law theory, and come from a Christian understanding of the human person and of the world. Right? So, for example, an important part of the moral law from a Christian perspective is going to be the Old Testament and the basic moral principles that we receive in Scripture. Right? Well, why are these things important? Why are they necessary? They're largely important and necessary because of the Christian understanding of sin. Right? That we don't begin kind of as blank slates who can then choose kind of even-handedly between good and bad, between right and wrong. That we are in fact born into a sinful world and with corrupted natures. And so we don't have kind of a fair shake, a fair chance to choose the good over the evil from the beginning. That we are kind of weighted down towards choosing wrongly by our corrupted natures and by the examples we see around us. And so, because of the acknowledgement of that reality of sin in the world, a Christian account of natural law is going to include this divine law, right? Divinely revealed moral law that is going to supplement and assist our innate sense of right and wrong. It's going to assist the formation of our conscience, right? That sinful human beings on their own aren't going to be able to choose rightly. So you get the Ten Commandments, you get the other basic moral teachings of Scripture to give us a kind of template to right ourselves with, right? That we can look at it and say, yes, of course, now I recognize, now it kind of comes to mind that I shouldn't be doing these things. I shouldn't kill, I shouldn't commit adultery, I shouldn't covet, I shouldn't bear false witness, all those things, which a non-fallen nature would be able to perceive and know without assistance, but our fallen sinful natures need that extra boost, that extra guide to help shape them and help them kind of start off on the right path. So you need that Old Testament law, that part of divine law, on account of our sinful nature. But that's not all there is, of course, to the Christian story that kind of supplements or goes beyond what we find in Aristotle. Of course, there's the happier side of that as well, right? The idea that we as human beings don't have a purely natural end. We aren't designed just to lead flourishing lives in this world as we experience it now. We are, in fact, ultimately destined for the beatific vision and for an eternal life in a new and restored and transformed world with God. And because we have that higher end, we also then need more development, right? And how do we develop ourselves beyond a purely natural end toward the supernatural end? Well, we need grace. We need grace to be infused in us to help us go beyond what we could obtain through purely natural development. And then we also need the other part of divine law and the new law, right? The moral principles revealed through Christ in the New Testament especially. And so we need that divine law both to account for our sinful natures and also to help us move beyond purely kind of natural goodness to the point of becoming like Christ so that we can be with God in eternity. And so that's why we need that law in a Thomistic account of natural law. That's why we need revealed law. And then, of course, human laws should follow natural law and divinely revealed law in helping us, again, choose rightly against our sinful natures and towards fulfilling our natural ends. All right, so that really kind of, I think, accounts for the law component explained here in the chapter. What about the grace? Well, again, I think the textbook does a pretty nice job of explaining in Aquinas how grace worked and how these infused virtues can elevate human nature to the point where it can have this end of eternal relationship with God and the beatific vision. Now, one of the things that struck my attention as I was reading this chapter is we run into here again this difficulty of explaining how free will and grace work together. So if you've been moving through the course of study here in the program, right, we've encountered this in our study of Paul in the New Testament, where he spends a lot of time talking about human free will and also grace and predestination and election. And of course, we encounter this again in church history and looking at the thought of Augustine and looking at Calvin and other reformers. And here we run into it again in Aquinas in his account of grace and the moral life. And the same sort of challenges exist here, right? Now, one of the things that the textbook does nicely, I think, is show how these two ideas really can't be separated, right? That grace is something that comes from outside, but it also then becomes, in some ways, part of us and internal to us. But at the same time, even our free will is not something that's purely our own. It is, in fact, given to us by God. And so this sense of us being kind of naturally autonomous agents isn't really right either. And ultimately, there is no perfect explanation I can give you of how grace and free will work together. But again, I think there are some things to bear in mind, at least to avoid thinking that this is some sort of obvious contradiction. Right? It's important to recognize that we, in Aquinas' account at least, were never intended to be these purely autonomous beings who would have kind of an absolutely free will. Right? That, again, this is one of the distinctive features of a Christian natural law. We were designed from the beginning with the ultimate end of having a relationship with God. Right? So it's not some kind of foreign, unnatural intervention into our nature for God to enter into us and to draw us to himself. That's what we are naturally supposed to be. That's what's naturally supposed to happen as part of our nature. So it's not kind of compelling us contrary to ourselves to become something else. That is our nature, to be in relationship with God. We also need to recognize that God is not some other person or some other being in the ordinary sense, right? That God is, in fact, being itself, that God supports and sustains everything that exists at every moment, right? And so having God, again, working within us, giving us these graces, is not something alien or something foreign to us. Simply to exist, God must be supporting us and upholding us. And so for those graces to come from God's indwelling, from the infusion of grace, again, if we think of it as God is coming into us and doing this, that can be misleading, right? That God is always within us and supporting us and allowing us to do whatever it is we do. Now again, this doesn't mean that there's no tension here, that there's no difficulty. But I think sometimes if we don't acknowledge the limits of our ability to talk about God, or to talk about God as if God's some other being, these problems can seem bigger than they might be if we step back and think about what does it really mean to be a creature? What does it really mean to see God working in us as creatures? So again, I think it will remain a challenge. But I think it also, if we reflect on it, and don't come into it seeing as, well, this is a real problem, I don't know how I can accept this. If you think about this and how, on the one hand, we are autonomous and free, but on the other hand, we're dependent on God and on external causes to do everything we do, I think, at least in my experience, that this, in fact, really kind of matches my own experience of what it's like to be human when I take the time to pause and kind of reflect on my inner life. So anyways, we again can leave that here for now, because I think otherwise the textbook does a fine job of talking about these things. So let's go ahead and move on now to the next page. Really, the focus of this section of the book is on the difference it makes when you have this integrated approach to Thomas's ethics as opposed to kind of a strictly classical natural law ethical system. And really, again, I think you could say, going all the way back to the introduction, that's really the overall thesis of the book, or at least one of the primary points they want to get across, is that this is the right way to read Thomas, and that it does make an important difference. But as we get here to the end, I think the question can come up, well, exactly what difference does this make? How does a life lived according to Thomistic natural law look different than, say, a life lived according to Aristotelian natural law? And this is, again, a kind of challenging topic. One of the main advantages of using natural law as our ethical system, particularly in today's kind of pluralistic society, is that, unlike some other Christian ethical systems, it doesn't require you necessarily to accept the Christian faith or to accept Scripture in order to reach moral agreement or moral consensus, right? That if people can recognize some of the basic attributes of human nature and what leads to human happiness and flourishing, then we can reach agreement on a range of different moral topics. So to talk about how a Thomistic account of natural law differs from Aristotelian at least raises the question of, if the difference is too great, then aren't we kind of undercutting one of the main benefits of natural law ethics to begin with? And there is, I think, there is something to that concern. And there are some natural law theorists today who really kind of argue for a strictly natural approach to natural law, one that doesn't include any beliefs explicitly in God or in a supernatural end for human beings, along these lines of saying that it's better for reaching consensus with non-Christians. And again, I think it's a good thing to reach as much consensus as we can, but at the same time, the whole point of natural law is to root our actions, to root our choices in life in a true understanding of who we are as human beings, who we are as finite creatures in this particular universe. And I think that should be rooted in the best, the most accurate picture we can have of the human person, of the universe. From a Christian perspective, a true account of that is going to include an understanding of God, an understanding of our ultimate end of being united with God in the beatific vision. Now, again, that's all very kind of theoretical, very abstract. Concretely, what real difference would it make? Are we going to look at an Aristotelian natural law follower and say, oh, look at that terrible person? Well, no. Really, what's going to be promoted by an Aristotelian natural law is going to be a good moral life. It's going to be one that we look at, and if they were to follow it kind of perfectly, which would be difficult or impossible, it would be a very morally exemplary life. We would all look at that person and say, wow, that person really lives well, that person really lives morally. Okay, so what is the Christian difference? Well, the Christian difference in a lot of ways corresponds to what we see exemplified by Jesus in the Gospels and taught by Jesus in the Gospels, right? It's that going beyond what is required, right? So, attacking someone in the street is going to be wrong for either system, right? Now, if I'm an Aristotelian natural law follower and I'm in the street and somebody comes up and slaps me upside the head to insult me, I am perfectly justified in slapping them back, right? That there's nothing immoral about using force to respond to an unjust use of force. What's the Christian difference? Well, the Christian difference is, of course, Jesus' teaching to turn the other cheek, that we are willing to, in fact, go beyond what is morally permitted to seek something even higher, right? And that's really where the difference is going to come in. The textbook's explanation, for example, of the vice of sloth, I think is very interesting, and is something I want to go back and consider some more. But in a lot of ways, as I was reading this chapter, I'm also teaching a class where we're reading the Gospels. And it struck me that there's a correspondence there, that this depiction we get of sloth in our textbook really applies in a lot of ways to all the different people Jesus interacts with in the Gospels, right? That Jesus is constantly calling to people, whether it's the ordinary people caught up in their daily lives and in wanting some free bread and looking for miraculous signs, and not really wanting to focus on their spiritual well-being, right? You also have the religious leaders who are caught up in their prestige and in their place of honor and in their material wealth. And again, not wanting to make that effort to go beyond that to the more important spiritual reality that Jesus is trying to point them toward. And in both cases, you have sloth as it's described here in our chapter, right? Not just kind of physical laziness, but a refusal to accept this higher good that's offered to us because we don't want to disrupt our enjoyment of the lower goods that we have as part of this natural life. So I think there is really a lot to be had from this account of sloth. And I think it also does a nice job of showing the difference between a Christian natural law and a classic Aristotelian one, right? That in a lot of ways is going to be basically what we see in Jesus, right? This going beyond what is required, right? So Aristotle, for example, is going to reject pride, reject a kind of vainglory, esteeming yourself more than you are really worth. And of course, Christianity is going to do that as well, but Christianity is going to call for humility that Aristotle would not call for, right? Why? Well, why do we need this humility? And why wouldn't Aristotle call for that? Well, for Aristotle, the human person, the human life lived rightly is really the highest point we can reach. I mean, that's really the goal. And so if you are, in fact, a virtuous, flourishing person, there's no particular need to be humble because you have, in fact, attained kind of the ultimate goal. Whereas in Christianity, even if you're living kind of a basically good, flourishing life, there's, of course, something still that is immeasurably beyond you, right? You are, there's still God, right? And that acknowledgement, that reality, should lead us to be humble. And so that's going to be an important, noticeable difference between Christian natural law and Aristotelian. And then also, again, I think, finally, there is this point of what's our goal, right? And in many ways, natural law is going to come back to that over and over again, right? It all is rooted in your understanding of the human person and what the goal is, right? And your understanding of that goal is going to shape, of course, how you live your life to reach that goal, right? And so for Aristotle, this goal is, again, this flourishing person who's leading an exemplary natural life. They succeed in their career, they succeed in their family, in their social relationships, in their health, and all these things. And that's going to be an attractive goal, and you're going to have to work hard to get there. But that's going to be kind of the long and the short of it. For the Christian, there's going to be this higher goal, right? And it's going to be a goal of becoming more and more like God, right? And again, as I talk about in pretty much all of my classes, what's distinctive about the Christian view of God? Well, it's the fact that God is a Trinity, right? And God is made up of these persons that are in continual perfect relationship with one another, right? And they're relationships of complete and total giving of each person to the other, right? So Father and Son completely and totally give themselves to one another in the Trinity. And so that is our model, that is our goal. And so that's going to then change in important ways how we live, right? That we're not going to be content with laying claim to what we are due, right? In Aristotle, if you are this excellent person, you are due a certain amount of respect, you are due a certain amount of wealth, you are due a certain amount of social standing, prestige, and all these things. And you don't need to turn around and give that up. In fact, it is justly yours. But as Christians, right, we have this ultimate example of God that we are aiming for, right? And God doesn't lay claim to and hold on to what is rightly God's. God is sacrificially loving, right? And so it's turning around and sacrificing even what we are due based on our goodness or excellence as persons. And so that is going to shift in important ways all kinds of different aspects of our moral principles and our guides, right? And again, I think this ties in very nicely with the conclusion of the book, which is very well done, right? And pointing out that natural law, properly understood, begins and ends in love, right? So that it begins from this basic realization that everyone, when they act, is doing so because they are seeking some good, right? They love something, right? They are seeking something out that they perceive as good. And that guides all moral action from our very first moments, from our beginning as moral agents. And then our ultimate end is ultimate love, right? Our ultimate goal as persons is to exemplify as much as we can that love that we find in God, which is going to be a sacrificial love. Now again, Aristotle is going to say human beings are social animals, right? And so having good relationships with others is going to be a part of his system. He's certainly not arguing for people who are cut off from others and only concerned about themselves. But there's not going to be that extra that we see in Christ, that we see in the Gospels, and that we see in the life of the Trinity. That's what's going to be distinctive about a Christian natural law system. And that's what I think is brought out so nicely in this account of Aquinas' ethics. All right, well, we will leave that there for now. And as always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the section and any questions you might have on Blackboard.